Few film franchises have as strange of a journey as the Mad Max saga. At first a scrappy Ozploitation production made to help its team break into mainstream films, and eventually a modern action juggernaut. But there's one film that feels strangely out of place in the larger reputation of the franchise. A film that was not only the most ambitious in the series at the time, but that ended it for decades. That film is 1985's Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. A big-budget entry looking to capitalize on the growing popularity of the series, but whose production is marked by a tragedy that changed creator George Miller's career forever. Now, nearly 40 years later, this trilogy capper is almost a footnote in the reinvigorated history of Mad Max. But for decades, it was just as instrumental in the perception of the franchise as anything else. So what went wrong with this Part 3? How does this cartoonish, almost kid-friendly take reinterpret Mad Max for the mainstream? Get ready for the adventure that nearly ended Max Rokitansky. This is Thunderdome. When Mad Max 2 was released in Australia, George Miller's sequel doubled the box office of the original film with a take of 10.8 million Australian dollars. And when it was released in the United States as The Road Warrior, disconnecting it from the first, which was barely screened at all in the US, it made another 23.6 million. The success gave Miller and Company what they had been seeking with their first entry, a breakthrough into the mainstream outside of the then tiny Australian film industry. Miller would soon after produce and co-direct two Australian TV miniseries, The Dismissal and The Cobra Breakout. But he also got his biggest taste of big-budget Hollywood filmmaking as one of the directors of Twilight Zone, the movie, making the Nightmare at 20,000 Feet entry in this anthology and really showing up his fellow directors. This segment rips. Also, John Landis straight to jail. Soon after, Miller and longtime friend and producing partner Byron Kennedy set about returning to Australia and making a third Mad Max film. But as opposed to the very stripped down and lean stories of the first two films, this new Max would have a much bigger scope, boosted by the film's $10 million budget, much more than the $4.5 million for Road Warrior and the $350,000 for the original movie. Miller took inspiration from three sources for this adventure. First, Lord of the Flies, expounding upon the idea of the feral kid in the Road Warrior with a cargo cult of children that Max finds and protects. Second, Lawrence of Arabia as direct reference for the film's expansive desert scope and even specific shots. In fact, Miller brought in Lawrence composer Maurice Jarre to score the film. And third, author Russell Hoban would later say that he approached Miller to film an adaptation of his book Ridley Walker. The book, published in 1980, is a post-apocalyptic tale about the remnants of humanity recreating society after nuclear war, with their language, myths, and technology all salvaged and twisted from the previous world. Hoban said that Miller declined, but the similarities of Beyond Thunderdome's oral tradition Child Tribe nearly led him to sue. Ultimately, Miller was so interested in the idea that he would have made the film without Max if Gibson didn't want to return, with the director saying, "We liked the story so much I think we would have made it, but not as a Mad Max film. We would have invented some other world to tell it in, but we got keen on the story." Mel is very straightforward and honest. I mean, he doesn't play games. We could have offered him 10 times his normal fee, but if he didn't like the story, he'd never do it. And it was simply a matter of telling him the story, and he said, "Oh yes, I can see this is going to be different, more interesting than what we've done before. Let's do it." Every Mad Max film is only partly about Max, even the first, and it's clear that this interest in the world outside of his title character has always been there, only now fully being lived out in the Furiosa prequel set to premiere soon after this video's publication. But the road to Thunderdome nearly came to an end on July 17, 1983, when Byron Kennedy was killed in a helicopter crash in New South Wales, Australia. Kennedy was only 33 years old, and, in the aftermath, Miller was overcome with grief over the death of the friend who had been with him on every step of his filmmaking journey. "I was reluctant to go ahead," said Miller. And then there was a sort of need to do something just to get over the shock and grief of all of that. We were like filmmaking brothers, and he was also one of those people who was pretty indestructible. And he was almost one of the last people you'd think would die in a helicopter accident. Of course, looking back on it, helicopters are dangerous, as are cars, as is life. So that had a big effect, and I remember sort of feeling this very zombie-like state going through the film. Miller simply didn't have the heart to direct the entire movie, and turned to theater director George Ogilvie, who had helped mentor him. So it was decided that Miller would handle directing the action sequences, while Ogilvie directed all the rest. While Ogilvie was an experienced stage and TV director, Beyond Thunderdome was his first feature film, and clearly, while Miller had stepped back from some duties, he was still involved throughout. But Beyond Thunderdome is a very split experience. Its narrative is split between two civilizations. Its directing duties are split between two creators with very different sensibilities. And its intended audience is split between the viewers expecting the hard edge of the first two movies, and a hopefully larger audience lured in by this movie's PG-13 rating and more softball approach to action. It is, frankly, insane that this movie premiered only 6 years after the original Mad Max. The look, the budget, Miller's skills, Mel Gibson's weathered face. Did you know he's only 29 years old in this movie? His face looks like a catcher's mitt. If you told me 20 years separated parts 1 and 3, I'd believe you. Anyway, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, directed by George Miller and George Ogilvie, and written by Terry Hayes and George Miller, opens with Mel Gibson's Max Rokitansky once again wandering the wasteland, when nearly all of his possessions are stolen, leading him to Bartertown, and quickly becoming embroiled in the conflict between dueling leaders Auntie Entity and Master Blaster. But when things don't go Max's way, he winds up needing to protect a cargo cult of wild children from the post-apocalyptic world, once again placing responsibility on a lone wolf that helps to change the future. Yes, I know that plot doesn't really make sense. We'll get into that. Beyond Thunderdome is easily the most outlandish and often the most cartoonish of any of the Mad Max movies. There's always a streak of surreality in these films, a mix of Miller's frenetic approach to how he creates action, and a byproduct of these stories taking place in a post-apocalyptic world where society is made up of people who have gone at least a little insane. Beyond Thunderdome really amps this up.
Dying times here.
Bartertown is a caricature of a post-apocalyptic society. It's all dirt and mohawks and scraps of old cultures refurbished by the people that found them. The film adds just a little bit more context to the world of Mad Max, revealing for the first time that nuclear war helped cause this future, beyond the energy crisis that first shook society.
What's a little fallout, huh?
Here, we're far enough along into the future that mini societies are being created once again. Something hinted at by the narration of The Road Warrior. Ultimately, I think that adds a spark of hope back into the franchise, knowing that while everything was once lost, life can begin again. And this is what makes Max into a heroic figure. The most heroic he really is in the entire series. This is not a disillusioned cop whose world and mind is shattered. This is not a feral wanderer who can only briefly touch others' lives before losing what little he has. This is not an insane survivor who must elevate another to a role as savior. This is Max the hero. At first, Max is only interested in doing Auntie a favor by killing Blaster, the giant man carrying around the tiny master, to get his stolen possessions back. Of course, Max is screwed over and exiled, but this doesn't become a revenge story. I actually think Max doesn't even have revenge on his mind. This is about saving the young, the disabled, and the disadvantaged from the people that would exploit or kill them without remorse. The amount of time that's passed since the collapse also means that essentially all gasoline, petitioned to only refer to gas as gasoline from now on, it's way cooler, is gone, and any remaining cars have been broken down and repurposed over and over until they barely resemble what they were before. And that means that, yes, Beyond Thunderdome is a Mad Max movie that's almost entirely without car chases. To me, that's insane. Yes, there's a car versus train chase at the very end, but what is Mad Max without cars? I get that Miller was going for something different here, but that's like Jackie Chan making a movie without getting severely injured. It just don't work like that. With Fury Road essentially being one giant car chase, Thunderdome looks even more like the odd one out. This third film is also much more of an adventure movie than an action one, more interested in Max's journey to and through different strange civilizations than the fights themselves. This is clearly a byproduct of the split directorial duties that brought the film to life, and when you watch it with that in mind, you can sense the very different mindsets that went into bringing these pieces to life. Miller has his signature frenetic style for action, while Ogilvie is much more patient behind the camera, letting it all play out in the quieter moments. Despite the complications in production and Miller's personal challenges, a lot of Thunderdome's action scenes really do rip. In particular, the showdown between Max and Blaster within the Thunderdome itself is easily the highlight of the movie. with the two combatants locked inside a giant version of that metal dome my elementary school used to have, but with weapons, bungee cords, and no padded sandy ground to help the kids when they inevitably fall, the Thunderdome fight is really inventive, as both Max and Blaster are constantly trying to get one up on the other, flying around the cage in their harnesses and never quite getting the upper hand with the brutal weapons found lying around the dome. The result is that the fight takes place on both a horizontal and vertical axis, as well as everything in between. I really think this is a brilliant work of pure action invention, complete with some big twists and turns in its final moments. I guess it's not too surprising to say that Thunderdome peaks with Thunderdome, as it's after this that the movie takes a hard right turn into its kid-centric narrative. You know, for the longest time as a kid who had never seen any of these movies but constantly saw their covers in Blockbuster or heard about them from my parents, I always thought that Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome must have surely come after a movie called Thunderdome. Like, everybody knows about Mad Max Thunderdome, but what my sequel posits is, what if we went beyond it? There are some bewildering choices made in this movie's production. Bringing Bruce Spence back as Jedediah, another flying character who is now a biplane pilot but is not the gyro captain he played in The Road Warrior, is just kinda confusing. It doesn't help that this pilot is nowhere near as interesting of a role, which makes him look like a poor imitation. Apparently, Spence was hired last minute when they had trouble casting for the character. There's overall too many elements here that are just doing the previous two films over again, but to a much less successful degree. I know that a lot of the Mad Max movies repeat themes and motifs, but there is a fine line between revisiting ideas and just doing the same thing again. Our climactic chase of the train against Bartertown is just the tanker chase of The Road Warrior, but now with kids and a vehicle that doesn't turn. Its finale essentially puts our hero back in the same place he ended the two previous movies, complete with Max once again sacrificing himself to allow another group to escape. And maybe this sounds like an oversimplification, but there's just way too many annoying characters here. The gyro captain and his annoying little shitboy son grate on my nerves.
Anybody moves, and a dead mate!
I don't really care for Master, and Iron Bar Bassie is basically a Wile E. Coyote character who simply will not die, no matter how much you want him to, and I really want him to die. You might notice that a lot of those elements come to the forefront in the second half of the film, as Miller and Ogilvie make a hard pivot about 40 minutes in, with Max banished to the wasteland and running into our child tribe inside a mini oasis. While I think that the second half focused on the children is much weaker than its first half, there are a lot of interesting ideas to be found here. Max's introduction to the tribe is filled with half-remembered history and myths from a misunderstanding of who brought them to this valley, and why the world is the way it is. These ideas of Captain Walker, the Pockeyclips, and Morrow Land all illustrate that the children were part of a plane that tried to fly away from the nuclear attacks, crashing and finding the valley years ago. But one by one, all the adults left to find another land and never returned. That's a pretty sad and scary fate, but it's all seen through this film's much lighter outlook, and the idea that not only do these kids see their lives as some sort of fairy tale, but that Beyond Thunderdome is, ultimately, a fairy tale itself. This is essentially a cargo cult. Cargo cults are a phenomenon within the region of Melanesia, where the culture and beliefs of indigenous people were heavily influenced by encounters with soldiers centuries ago. These brief encounters without explanations of strange behaviors caused tribes to adopt rituals that resembled the military and other foreign customs, in the belief that cargo would drop from the sky for them. This sort of correlation mistaken for causation is found in how the child tribe has turned a plane and a pilot into a fantastical savior, waiting for the day of their rescue, and turning Max into an unwilling messiah. Miller and Ogilvie walk a fine line between showing how coincidence and faith confirm their beliefs, while also working to truly fulfill those beliefs.
I'm going home.
I'm going home.
The naivety and hope of the child tribe is as endearing as it is scary, with all of their hopes pinned on a legendary figure known as Captain Walker, who they believe to be Max. The survival of these kids depends on insulated belief that makes them horribly vulnerable to the threats of the outside world, beyond their idyllic little valley. Of course, they're destined to eventually run into Auntie-Entity's forces, and Max must once again accept a responsibility to protect them. Ultimately, I think that Beyond Thunderdome pushes a little too hard into pure fantasy in its second half, never really undercutting the fairy tale beliefs of its children, even when the much harsher world of Bartertown comes crashing back into the narrative. What's not a poor choice is the absolutely genius casting of the legend that is Tina Turner as Auntie Entity, ruler of Bartertown and generally our main antagonist for the film. Turner adds a real presence and strength to Auntie that the character needs to not simply feel like an asshole. She has her own goals and motives and will essentially use anyone to win, but by the end, we can't help but like her. It's not like she gets a ton of development, it's just that Tina has that charisma and presence you either got or don't. Turner also recorded 2 songs for the film. The opener, One of the Living, which automatically shows the audience that this is a big-budget mainstream production, and the end credits closer, We Don't Need Another Hero, which may be the greatest song of all time. I think it might have been proven by science. There is a larger arc to be found here that completes this trilogy, even if it mostly goes unspoken. At the end of the original Mad Max, Rokitansky is completely broken, leaving society behind and embracing madness. The Road Warrior returns Max to a small, desperate little society as the entire world has collapsed around him, making his healing essentially impossible. And while Max does sacrifice himself for the oil refinery survivors, he's also duped into fighting Humongous. Here, Max's choices and sacrifices are all done in full knowledge of what he's doing and giving up. He talks more. He's not nearly feral like in The Road Warrior. Gibson portrays him as a more fully formed person once again that, while frustrated by the kids he's suddenly put in charge of, does innately care about them. The Mad Max saga is made up of entries that basically exist independently of one another, with Miller going so far as to say there's no real chronology to the movies. The original Mad Max is a story of society mid-collapse. The Road Warrior is presented as a tale told by an elderly feral child, casting all of its mythical moments at a doubt. Fury Road borders on full-fledged fantasy. And in the end of Beyond Thunderdome, Max's story is passed on to new generations by Savannah in the ruins of Sydney.
But most of all remembers the man who finded us, him that came the salvage, and relights the city.
Every entry has Max pass into legend to some degree, but one of the strongest aspects of Thunderdome is that it fully restores Max's humanity. And while our Road Warrior may always be destined to remain apart from any remnants of the world, he is, once again, whole. Released on July 12, 1985, Beyond Thunderdome would go on to make $36.2 million at the box office, the biggest of the original trilogy. Still, its massive shift in tone turned it into a real love it or hate it kind of movie, just depending on your taste. Miller, however, looks back fondly. "It's the one I have the most affection for of the 3 films," said Miller, even though most people wouldn't agree. "I realized looking back on it that we almost took on too much story. We told about 2 or 3 different worlds, trying to juggle all those things together." However, after Beyond Thunderdome, the Mad Max franchise was essentially over for the next 30 years, largely due to Miller encountering setback after setback and turning his attention to making other movies. The film that would become Mad Max Fury Road was originally conceived in 1987, but wouldn't be finished until 2015. And so while it may not have been conceived as such, Beyond Thunderdome stood as the franchise finale for 3 decades. During that time, the Thunderdome itself worked its way into pop culture, and Gibson as Max, preferably without the overgrown mullet wig, became synonymous with the franchise, as well as many of the cartoonish takes of this Part 3. And while I think this 3rd film is an extremely flawed creation, its ending is a pretty much perfect send-off for Max Rokitansky, once again responsible for humanity's future and retreating back into myth. Whether Miller never makes another Mad Max movie or the franchise carries on forever, Max will always be out there in the wasteland, waiting for us when we need him most. Thanks for watching today's video, and I've now talked about every Mad Max movie. Years and years ago, I did a video on The Road Warrior, and slowly over time I've skipped around the franchise. So if you enjoyed this video, I have videos on the original Mad Max, The Road Warrior, Fury Road, and now Beyond Thunderdome. Although I am interested in going back and remaking my video on The Road Warrior. And I had originally thought about doing that for this video, because this is timed out to come out shortly before Furiosa premieres. But I thought, why not talk about Thunderdome? Because there are so many weird things to talk about with this movie. And while this is easily my least favorite of the franchise, I don't think that it's a bad movie. Just one that's compromised by a real-world tragedy, and that isn't as sharp or memorable as the other 3. It's pretty hard to match up to at least The Road Warrior and Fury Road. And at the time of making this video, I haven't seen Furiosa yet, but I'm very excited to watch it. And hopefully I'll make something on this channel to tell you all my thoughts on that movie. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Beyond Thunderdome, as well as your own ranking of the entire Mad Max saga. For me, it's Fury Road at the top, followed by Road Warrior, then the original Mad Max, and then this movie. Of course, there's also a couple Mad Max video games to talk about if I ever want to get around to that, because clearly I can't stop talking about Mad Max. As always, a thank you to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video, and exclusive Patreon-only reviews, with our look at the films of Hayao Miyazaki continuing only on Patreon. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and going just a little mad.